And welcome to CPA Ontario's Practical Experience Enabling Competencies webinar. My name is Simi Bogle, and I'm a coordinator with the Employer Relations team. This webinar was developed to assist CPA students in meeting the reporting requirements for enabling competencies. We invited you to send us your questions when registering for this webinar. We received many great questions and will aim to answer as many as possible within the time frame provided. Please note, all participants of this webinar are muted. If you have additional questions, you are able to ask them via the question mark icon, and our team of experts will either answer your questions directly or the presenters will answer your questions at the Q&A portion of this webinar. There are 5 attachments provided for your reference in the handouts section. Okay, before we begin, we're just going to do a quick poll to get some responses on whether you have documented your enabling competencies in PERT.
Okay, so it looks like we have quite a few people here who have actually began to document their enabling competencies in PERT, and a handful of people who haven't. So either way, this webinar will definitely help guide you through turning those responses from level 0s and 1s to 2s, or even just help you start documenting your enabling competencies. Today, we will go over mainly the enabling competencies. However, we will begin with an overview of the practical experience requirements. Then we will talk about the enabling competency requirements. So a common question was, what is required for a level 2 response? We will also look at some examples of enabling competencies, go over our values, and discuss common issues we see with level 2 responses. At the end of the webinar, we will open it up to question and answer. First, we'll talk about the certification program and an overview of what this means. As you progress through each stage of the CPA certification program, you will be able to choose a path that suits your learning style and your lifestyle. It also is important to realize that the program is designed to meet the needs of industry, government, and public practice by ensuring that all CPAs coming out of this program have a strong foundation of knowledge and skill as professional accountants in order to succeed in whatever role you take on. The CPA certification program includes the academic study portion, so before you register as a PEP student, PEP, which is the CPA PEP modules, and your common final exam. As you can see here, your practical experience should be recorded and reported throughout this entire period. Here is a slide that exemplifies the summary of our common 5 requirements. All students, regardless of your pre-approved program or experience verification pathway, must have qualifying experience, appropriate supervision, must report and self-assess in PERT, every student must have a CPA mentor, and every student must submit assessments to CPA Ontario to be assessed for their competencies. All CPA students have the exact same exit requirements, regardless of how they earn their experience. There are 6 distinct technical competencies with sub-competencies under each category. So overall, you can earn up to 20 technical competencies. We have financial reporting, management accounting, audit and assurance, governance and strategy, finance, and taxation. The exit requirements are that a student achieves a core, so that means that you achieve 3 sub-competencies at a level 1 or higher from either financial reporting or management accounting. A depth, which means you achieve at least 2 level 2s in the specialized area and the rest at a level 1. And then a breadth, which means that you're getting exposure to most areas, but at least achieve overall 4 level 2s and 4 level 1s.
Thanks, Amanda. So we're going to talk about the proficiency levels next, and this is going to kind of be an underlying theme for the examples, because we're going to talk you through the differences between a level 1 and a level 2, especially what you need to get a level 2 in some of those key areas that you guys ask questions about. So on a high level, there are 3 proficiency levels. So you have a level 0, which is the first level, and this is, I guess, experience at, a purely administrative or clerical level. So think of a level 0 as, around the time when you're just beginning. It's probably your first time, having professional working experience. At a level 1, this is experience at the professional level, but lower than that of a level 2, which is what is expected of a newly certified CPA. At this point in time during your experience, you're working on tasks that, a little bit more routine in nature, perhaps have to be reviewed by a manager, but not at the most basic level of a level 0. And you're starting to work with a little bit more autonomy on more complex issues. And then at a level 2, we've said that you've met the level expected of a newly certified CPA. So tasks at this point, they can be complex, undertaken with autonomy. You're starting to think about, the what ifs of your analysis, what you can do better going forward. So going to the enabling competency requirements. All right, so by the end of the term of practical experience, future CPAs are required to develop all 5 enabling competencies to a level 2 proficiency. So whereas Amanda was talking about your technical requirements earlier, so your core depth and your breadth, we like to think of this as like your soft skills. So how you're developing, for example, your professional and ethical behavior skills, your problem solving skills, how you communicate, your self-management skills, and also your teamwork and your leadership skills. So all of these enabling competencies are required to be at a level 2 by the end of your work term, so your 30-month duration. So each of the enabling competency questions consists of a 3-part question. So for the example that we're looking at here, so this is question on leadership and teamwork. And so the first part of any question is going to ask you to describe a time when you did something that demonstrates how you were demonstrating that enabling competency. It's also going to ask you to consider your different stakeholders, consider the impact that it had, and also going to ask you how you came to the conclusion that you did. So for example, describe a time when you managed a project or a team. What did you do to plan and execute this assignment effectively? Part 2 is going to ask you what you learned from the experience. And it's also going to ask you how those stakeholders that you identified, how they benefited from the actions that you took in Part A. Part C is going to ask you, and this is, I think, an area that a lot of students have difficulties with, and we'll go over some examples later, but Part C is going to ask you to put in some reflective thought to say, what could you do differently next time? You learned, I guess, some lessons in Part B, but what would you do differently next time to continue to build upon your enabling competency development? All right, so looking at level 2 requirements. So we're looking for you, 1, to adopt the CPA mindset and to talk about the CPA value that was impacted. And we'll go over the CPA values on the next slide. And the CPA way describes, how as a professional you're handling, different problem solving and issues within your role. Part B is to provide more than one alternative solution. So Part A asks you to identify a time that you address a particular situation. How did you come to that solution? What alternatives did you consider? And to list the pros and cons of those alternatives. The next thing that we're looking for is to ensure that the conclusion that you have is consistent with the analysis. So kind of intertwine this with the last point in which you have learning points for the future. We like to see specific actions that you could do differently going forward. So for example, it's not enough to say, I would do the same thing next time. That's great, but that's not showing that you put a lot of reflective thought into it. So when we ask, or if you have a reviewer say, what was the CPA value that was impacted in this situation, we're looking for you to describe how the situation applies to one of these 5 behaviors. So you have professional behavior, integrity and due care, how objective you are in a situation, how professionally competent you can be in a situation, and how you respect the confidentiality of that particular instance. So common issues with level 2 answers. So Amanda, would you like to give us some examples of some issues?
Yeah, it's definitely. So oftentimes as a reviewer, Janelle and I both experience students who submit enabling competency responses and they self-assess at a level 2, but often there's insufficient content to get them to that level 2 response. So a common one we see is that answers are just too short. So in the last slide, we talked about all of the things we look at to achieve a level 2 response, and it is almost impossible to submit a one-line response and achieve all of those bullet points that we just discussed. So answers too short. Another one I see commonly is that no CPA value is identified. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be very clear with your value, but we want to see that in your documentation you are exemplifying that you took on one of those CPA values. Janelle, any other?
Definitely. I think a point that I see often is that, and I elaborated a little bit on the previous slide, is that future considerations aren't realistic to the situation. A lot of times students do struggle with Part C in that, you know, we do see a lot of, I'd do the exact same next time, or I'd continue to build upon this in the same way next time. You know, Part C is super important for you to, you know, identify some reflective thought and say that there's always learning points that you could take from a situation. And to say like, okay, you know, I did this well this time, but this is what I want to do to help make this better in the future, or I could have, you know, built upon or improved upon this going forward. Duration is also not very realistic, and we will touch on some of these questions after. Not to say that you can't have a level 2 in your first report, but you're likely not going to have all 5 level 2s within the first 6 months of your reporting experience. How you handle a situation with your soft skills, you know, at month 1 is going to be quite different from how you're going to handle it at a more senior level at the end of your 30 months. I think another common one is we have rubrics. So within the technical and enabling competency areas, there are blue information icons within each question that do help you to identify the requirements of the particular area. So definitely helpful to make sure you're taking a look and referencing that.
Another common issue for sure that I see as well is, again, the years of experience that you have. So to touch a little bit more upon what Janelle was talking about is, of course, it's very possible for you with 6 months of work experience to earn a level 2 if you were put in a specific situation and you had to show your professional skill that early on in your career. But quite often we see the best responses from students occur in the 18 to 24 month mark, where you've been in your role for a specific amount of time, you've been in a professional environment, you've learned from your mentor, you've almost seen other CPAs act professionally, so that now you could be put in the same situation and act like a professional. So that's something we typically see. And again, it's when students are overestimating or underestimating their abilities. A lot of the times you don't know what you don't know. So you might have gone through an experience and thought that was a level 2 experience. And in fact, maybe that was really a level 1. And then 6 months more down the line, you go through another experience and then it sort of clicks to you to say, oh yeah, actually, this is a level 2. This was much more complex, much more, I had to consider much more in this example. This is my level 2 example. So important things to think about to sort of estimate, you know, what your response is if for level 2, were there multiple stakeholders, or who were your stakeholders? Were they important to the scenario? Were there options? Were there alternatives to your course of action? Did your experience, you know, impact more than just you? And were you communicating effectively? Did you learn a lot from this experience? And was it a big decision that you actually had to work through, analyze, decide pros and cons of all your alternatives, make a decision, and then act on it? So the more complex the scenario, the more likely that you'll be at a level 2.
And keep in mind too, it also mirrors kind of where you're at with your job duties and your technical competencies as well. And we had gone over the proficiency levels before. You know, at a level 0, you're not working as autonomously. You're working on more routine tasks. So as you're developing in your role and you're progressing and developing your technical skills, you know, you might progress, for example, from a junior to a senior financial analyst, and the level of autonomy that you'll have to work through problems or communicate to larger stakeholder groups, or work on an issue that you've never done before, you see how those are all closely related to the soft skills or to the 5 enabling competencies. So it's not that you can't have a level 2 in the beginning, but it's chances are as you progress and become more senior in your role, you're going to have more opportunities to develop those skills. So what we'll do next is Amanda will go through an enabling competency example. So one of the questions that we first got was, or one of the questions that we got a lot was, what is the difference between a level 1 and a level 2 response? And we'll bring you through an example for both.
So thanks, Janelle. Definitely a good question was what is the difference between a level 1 and a level 2 response? And now that we've sort of gone through a little bit of our expectation, on the slide here that we're presenting right now, you'll see an example that a student submitted for question 3 communication. They self-assessed at a level 2. So I'll give you a couple of moments to read through this slide, and we're going to post a poll to say, what do you think now that you know all that you know about what's required for level 2, what do you think this response should have been assessed at? So we'll take a couple seconds here and then we'll put up the poll. So you should be able to read through this and assign a level 0, a level 1, or a level 2.
I'll give you guys just a couple more seconds to get your responses in.
Okay, great. So it looks like here we actually had a lot of students respond at a level 0 or a level 1. And that's great. It's great that you've identified that it's not a level 2. We actually at CPA Ontario gave this a level 0. And so what we would discuss or how did the student go so off track here if they responded with a level 2 and we gave them a level 1? The first issue was the response was very brief. It was process oriented and very specific. As mentioned previously, you should use the rubric to formulate your response, and the student clearly did not. You need to start with a solid scenario that gives you a lot of flexibility to document options and ideas, and this specific scenario was very limited.
They were talking about note taking, so that doesn't give you
much option,
room,
yeah.
Right?
And the student was not able to identify alternatives or consider what they would do differently next time. So in general, this question or this response was not, the scenario was not complex enough or not elaborative enough to give the student the opportunity to answer and follow the rubric. So again, it was a limiting response. So this next response for communication, we'll walk through this, but this next response was an example of a level 2 response. So again, this student discusses a complex example of how they met with their operation managers to review budgets and assumptions. So the student talks about the different parts that they analyzed. They talked about what they did before the meeting and what they did during the meeting, and see how here they're discussing about ways they communicated. So they asked open and directed questions, and they prepared ahead of time. And then in the second part, the student again is very elaborative on how this experience benefited their organization. And here they clearly identified the CPA values. So you can see here directly in brackets, they're identifying that their value is professional behavior. And again, they go through the details and are very clear on how this experience has helped them in their organization and their learning. And then in part C, we can see here, which is, in my opinion, what I care for the most as a reviewer, is how did this student take this experience and how will they learn from it going forward? So when we see a student say, oh, I would not change a single thing moving forward, that proves to me that the student has not taken the opportunity at this time to clearly reflect on their experience and how this experience, and give themselves that feedback, right? And a part of being a professional is being able to give yourself some strong feedback. So this example is a good example, a level 2. We definitely don't need paragraphs and paragraphs, but it is clear that the student took some time to document this example, took some time to read the rubric, and took some time to genuinely reflect on their response.
Perfect. Okay. So then switching to question 1 on professional and ethical behavior. And so I think this is an area that students do have a lot of difficulty with because we often get, I do work for an ethical company. I haven't come across any issues of fraud. What if I don't have an example? Can I give, a tentative example of what I would do if the situation came up? So definitely all of your responses and your situations have to be factual. You're not allowed to give.
And Janelle, just sorry to interrupt, but another thing we see that is a no-no is students talk about examples they had through their PEP experience. So being on their group project in capstone or studying for their exams or whatnot. So we don't accept those responses. We accept only responses that you earned through employment.
Exactly, and through employment relating to that particular period. So while not all examples of professional and ethical behavior have to be extreme, for example, like you uncovered fraud within your company, it is important to note that there are some common examples that you may be faced with if you're making a professional decision that might question your ethics, and it's to ask you how you walked through considering that situation. So for example, if you work at a firm and you're working on a large engagement and you're being asked to eat your overtime, or the implication is there to eat your overtime or to not report that on the client file, you could be asked by a client to overlook an error that you found. You could be offered a gift from your client. We see that often, and you might have to consult your code of ethics at your organization to see if accepting that gift is appropriate. You might be asked to destroy or delete information. Even as simple as if you work for retail, you might have a customer ask if they can pay in cash and avoid HST. So not everything has to be very extreme, but there are definitely situations that you might see, and likely towards the end of your experience that might help get you proficiency in this area. Also important to note, and we'll go over mentorship a bit later, if you're having difficulties in any of these areas in terms of coming up with an example, this is a great way to use your mentor as a resource to discuss possible things that you might not have considered. So we have an example here for professional and ethical behavior. So I'll give you guys a moment and we'll walk through this. So while reviewing expenses for the period, I realized that an accrual was missing for material expense in the period. So my values of due care and professional competence were in conflict, as there was a pressure to have financial results ready to meet the reporting deadlines. So here a student has talked about an accrual that they missed, but why their professional values were conflicting is that they're under pressure to meet reporting deadlines. A common issue that we find in professional and ethical behavior is that students don't identify what the CPA value is that was impacted. And oftentimes it's two values that are conflicting, which is leading you to question whether or not your behavior is ethical. So the student did really good with identifying it in the first few sentences. So by overlooking the omission, we would definitely meet our reporting deadlines. However, it would result in a materially inaccurate representation of our expenses and liabilities. This would impact our working capital ratios as reported to the bank and our net income presentation to our stakeholders. If I corrected the results, it would take additional time to prepare the adjustment. However, I was able to request the assistance of my team to help pull together the necessary information. The accrual was recorded at the appropriate value, and we were able to meet our reporting deadlines. So again, really good in that the student identified who the stakeholders were that would be impacted if this accrual was missed, and also identified alternatives. They could not have reported that accrual. However, they were able to pull together the assistance of their team to get it done. So part B asks, what impact did your course of action have on all involved? So although our net income was lowered and our working capital ratio was impacted, we were able to maintain accurate financial reporting for our stakeholders. By getting the assistance of my team, we're also able to meet the reporting deadlines. So great to identify and continue off of part A, in which they identified the stakeholders and the impact that that correction had. So then part C, I like this response because it's a direct action in terms of what the student will do going forward to facilitate that behavior, or to continue to facilitate ethical behavior. Most definitely, I would expect a student to act in the same way that they did, making sure that they consider all the alternatives and, pulling together to ensure that they're acting in the most appropriate way. However, they were thinking outside the box here to say, I'll work with my manager to create a checklist of all the key tasks and processes we need to have completed for month-end close, including recording key accruals. This checklist would also include appropriate timelines to help ensure that we meet our reporting deadlines on time. So I would think that this is a great example of a level 2 response in which a student identified and hit all of the different areas that we were looking for. Right, so Amanda will talk about question 5.
Yeah, so question 5, teamwork and leadership. This one we often don't find students experiencing difficulty coming up with an example, because most of the time students actually will either work on a team or lead a team, and so we don't really see students struggle with coming up with an example and discussing their experience. Where we do find the struggle is in part C, where we get back to that self-reflection and self-feedback. And so we want to understand as a reviewer that you actually have taken away something from your experience and found a feedback point for yourself to continuously grow as a professional. So here's an example on our screen about part C in the teamwork and leadership, where it asks, having gone through this experience, what would you do differently next time? And so again, a very brief statement, but very impactful in that the student's describing, you know, while this experience has reinstated the importance of early communication and cross collaboration between team members, there are limitations to the extent that I should expect help. While my team is an incredible source available to me, everyone has their own responsibilities, especially during tight deadlines and completing each cycle. There are steps that I would take upon myself to prepare for the tasks ahead of time in order to minimize the overall workload. So the student has learned that in the future, they can't rely on their team to pick up when they feel overwhelmed or they've worked, or you know, they're on a tight deadline, and the student has now realize that, you know, next time maybe they'll create a list of tasks they would want to do or complete so that they would minimize their workload come crunch time. So again, very simple example, very simple response, but we want to see that the student's learning. Okay, our next example, it continues to the next slide, and the student discusses moving forward, I would make a better effort to familiarize myself with the process, take initiative. I also realized a few of my early testing questions for a couple of cycles could have been reduced by taking a step back and paying attention to detail. So again, this is another great example of a student finding little things in their process that they would change differently or do differently next time. And so it's really important, even with a question so simple as teamwork and leadership, of working on a team project or working amongst a team, to call out things that you should consider doing differently this time, differently next time rather. And so this one was another great example of the student maybe saying that it was their fault, or taking some fault to say, maybe next time I would pay a little bit more attention to detail, and we wouldn't be in this situation again. Okay. Another area that we received a lot of questions on was problem solving and decision making. So again, we find a lot of students sort of coming up with examples that that might be from school or from their exams or working in a team on their capstone. And what we understand that with problem solving and or even decision making, you might need to be in a bigger or a tougher scenario where you're the one drawing the conclusion and making the decision or providing a recommendation for the decision. So we have presented here with an example of a good response, a level 2 response for problem solving and decision making. We'll leave this on the screen for you to review and read by yourselves, but one thing that I picked out of this one that I really liked is it's a great example of how the students addressed question number 1. And it's also a great writing tip, as you can see here, that the students sort of made mini references to the rubric. So here they just clearly identified, they said CPA value impacted, and then they discussed what that value was. And then they discussed, then they said, I assessed the situation and analyzed the major issues, and then they documented what they were. So they're following the rubric, the 6 points within the rubric, by clearly identifying at what point they're addressing that rubric. So if you're having trouble achieving a level 2 response and you really think you have a good example and the issue might just be documentation, then you might want to take an approach like this student by formatting your response to sort of make sure that the reviewer sees that you're considering all of the aspects of the rubric. So again, this was a really lengthy response, and the student continues to document their experience. And then in the next slide, what I like about the student's response is that, again, with their Part C, they had a future point of feedback. So I learned that a delay in payment can impact a relationship, which was great. But then the student says, I learned to determine what is the first priority. Building on this experience, I will be more proactive and also communicate to the business department of the reasoning of the incidents and impact that it may have. So again, the student has learned through this experience how to now become even more professional than they were before.
Perfect. So we've gone through some examples that help you to differentiate, I guess, the differences between a level 1 and a level 2. And hopefully you saw some common themes between all of those in terms of, how you apply the CPA way in terms of what CPA values impacted, the different alternatives that you consider, assessing some pros and cons, and then really making sure that you think about, what you could do in the future and do differently going forward. So the next section that we'll talk about is mentorship. And often we do get a lot of questions as to, the mentor roles, or how do I use my mentor, within my practical experience. And so the primary purpose of a mentor is to help guide in a student's competency development. And so, it's to be expected that if you're required to self-assess yourself twice a year, so every time you complete an experience report, so say that you do an experience report every 6 months, you set it to verified, and you'll request a meeting with your mentor to go over your development and your progress for that period, but also to create goals and discuss, any challenges that you might have had or what you would potentially want to work on going forward. So it's important to note, and we'll talk about kind of the penalty that's required, that you are required to meet with your mentor semi-annually and to document the meeting formally in PERT. So when you do have, your mentor meeting set up, you can say, okay, what am I going to discuss in my mentor review? So as I was saying previously, you want to discuss your progression for the prior period. So make sure that you have your experience report prepared. This includes your technical and any enabling competencies that you might have. You want to discuss any challenges that you had in the previous period. So for example, I'm struggling to get that final level 2 in professional ethical behavior. You can ask your mentor to provide some feedback on their own experiences, and also maybe to provide some different insight as to, some of the things that you're working on that you might not have considered from your role. You can talk about any significant projects or examples that relate back to some of the different areas that you have, or anything else that you feel a reviewer might find useful when reviewing your report. So us definitely, Amanda and I, when we're looking at your profession assessments, we'll definitely go to the mentor comments to see. It's almost like to corroborate some of the development that you had during the period. So the student did really well on X, Y, and Z. I can see that, they're appropriately developing in their enabling. So any issues that your mentor might have, or any, progress points that they have, they can also include those comments for us there as well. But, don't be afraid to kind of go into detail with your mentor as to any challenges or difficulties or goals that you want to set going forward. So important to note that student versus mentor responsibilities. So as a student, you are responsible for requesting your mentor review in PERT prior to meeting with your mentor. And if it's your first time in PERT, you're creating experience reports, it's important to note that you need to have at least one report in verified status in order to request a mentor review in PERT. With that being said, your mentor is not responsible for approving your experience reports, especially if you're within the EVR pathway. That's done by your supervisor, but your mentor is responsible to discuss your self-assessment and your progress. Once you request a mentor review and you meet with your mentor is responsible for formally completing this within PERT and providing a summary if applicable to the period that you're discussing. I was mentioning the penalty earlier. So students, you will be required to complete an additional 30 days of reporting. So 1 month duration penalty for every missed mentor review that you have in PERT. So you're required to have 2 mentor reviews for every 12 months of current experience. If when we review, for example, your 12-month assessment or your completion assessment, and we see that you're missing a mentor review, you will be assessed that duration penalty. So important to keep in mind, especially if you have any missed mentor reviews right now, make sure you go and double check and make sure that you're up to date with your reporting. It's important to remember that reporting is progressive throughout the entire duration of your practical experience. It's not something that you should be saving all for the end and then documenting all 5 of your experience reports at once. Make sure that as you get into PERT, even if it's to keep your experience report open and continue to document your progression, especially if you're within EVR and you have to give more examples to corroborate your experience, make sure that you're reporting and you're self-assessing up to date. And same with PPR students. Make sure you're completing your self-assessment, every 6 months, for example, so that you also have something up to date to discuss with your mentor when you do meet with them, as that is a requirement, a practical experience requirement. All right, so we're a bit ahead of schedule, but we're going to get to some of the general Q&As that we had from the registration that you guys had submitted. So Amanda, first question for you. How are the summary questions at the end of the enabling competency section evaluated?
Ooh, good one. So those to whoever asks those questions point are not required in the sense of they're not required to be at a level 2 response, but they are required to be answered when you filled out any of your enabling competencies. And so again, it's not that they're being evaluated for a level 1 or level 2 or level 0, but what they are helping is Janelle and I as reviewers, especially come completion time, to just get a better sense of, taking a step back, is the student ready to be a CPA? So again, understanding how you have reflected in those responses, reading your responses, assessing whether they were responded in a professional manner. If you took some time to respond to them and not write like NA or something like that in them, really then shows me and shows Janelle as reviewers who are saying, hey, yes, the student's ready for completion, that you are ready for completion. So they're very important and they should still be taken very seriously and responded with the utmost professional responses. But again, they don't need to be evaluated at a level 2, but that we look at them when we're considering you for completion.
Perfect. And so we're actually going to put the second question in the poll, and we're going to say, so at what point should I start documenting my enabling competencies? So we're going to leave this poll open up for you guys right now and give you a minute to respond. Okay, and we'll close it down. All right, so 89% of you said from the beginning. That makes my heart very happy. Only 11% of you guys said after 12 months of current practical experience, and none of you guys said after 24 months, so that's good. So Amanda, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so we definitely encourage students to document their enabling competencies as soon as they've experienced any of those 5 enabling competencies. So what we don't want students to do is every single experience report fill them out with fake examples for the sake of filling them out. We want you to fill them out as you are experiencing them. So obviously that means from the very beginning, if you've experienced any of them from the very beginning. And so most commonly we see students maybe fill out communication or teamwork as one of their first ones. And so absolutely we want to see you fill them out as you experience them.
Mm-hmm. And I guess an important thing to remember is that it's okay if you only have, and this kind of lends into the next question, it's okay if you only have, 1, for example, documented in your first report. It's as you develop experiences that are applicable to that soft skill, you can report them. So
absolutely, and I often prefer seeing a student spend some time answering 1 or 2 in each experience report so that we know that you're actually spending that time reflecting and documenting, and I'd rather have 2 good ones than 5 mediocre ones. So make sure you actually just fill out the ones that are applicable to you and applicable in that time period.
And I find a lot of times too as well, and to kind of go off what Amanda said, is that students, I guess, anticipate that, you know, the enabling, it's the easy part. It's like I've spent and put all of my time into the technical areas, but they don't give the enabling the time credit that it deserves. And then you do get questions that come back from your reviewer, and that often lends to, you know, a more frustrating process for you. So definitely take the time to document each one correctly. You should be reporting them from the beginning. And, you know, if you're treating your experience reporting as progressive and not saving it all to the end, this is going to help, especially to show your progression, but this is going to help, you know, keep things current in your head as well.
And another good question we got asked, which we see a lot of students struggle with, is how do I get a level 2 in self-management? So for those of you who might not know what's entailed in self-management, there are 3 different questions. So the first one is monitors and improves work performance. The other one is engages in professional development, and the third is recognizes limits to professional competence. And Janelle, I know you're gonna touch upon this, but we often see students answer the engages in professional development piece, which is really touches upon their career goals. So Janelle, where do you see some issues?
So I would say definitely the one that I see 90% of the time that students respond to is that career goal question. And oftentimes we do get a lot of one-liners because students think like, oh, this is the easy one. But definitely if you're thinking along like the level 2 kind of response and in terms of what we're looking for a level 2, I'm expecting a student to discuss multiple career goals. So, you know, have you shown me like 3 to 4 different career goals that you want to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years outside of getting your CPA. And, you know, getting your CPA is definitely very important, and that's why we're here, but you want to talk about other career goals that you have. So you might want to develop your management experience. You might want to get involved in different industries at work. You might want to become a mentor. You might want to develop your communication skills further. So give me a couple different goals to work with, and then specific actions as to how you're going to get that, and also how the different people, you know, in your network, your manager, your supervisor, your mentor, how they're going to help facilitate that. So if one of your career goals was, I want to develop my management and leadership experience, you know, your supervisor might put you in charge of a small team or put you in charge of the junior consultants, or, you know, give you opportunities to present on different issues to stakeholders if communication is something that you want to develop. So to think critically and say, okay, 3 to 5 career goals I have over the next 5 years, and how specifically I'm going to achieve those during this time.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that's great. We usually, again, to Janelle's point, see students just write, I want to be a CPA in 5 years from now, and I will do so by writing my CPA and completing my practical experience. And so it's a really tough one as a reviewer to review and judge, because we definitely know students have a lot more career goals than just that CPA. And so when you are answering that one, although, you know, it might be easy, again, spending some time reflecting and actually developing your response to meet all of the requirements will go a long way for that one.
And then the other 2 areas, I don't quite see students have as many issues. So, you know, naming a time you're not fully satisfied with a performance on a task, or, you know, that you were assigned work more slightly advanced than your capabilities. Those I don't think we see students having issues coming up with questions to. Definitely something that you want to consider that slide in which we talked about what the level 2 requirements are. So presenting the issue, presenting your alternatives, the pros and cons, all of those would still be applicable to those 2 questions. Just important to consider that the career goals one does require a bit of analysis as well. So the last question that we got, if we achieve a level 2 in a submitted report, do we have to continue to fill out that competency area on future reports?
The answer to that is no. If you do feel, and we have assessed you at a level 2 in a previous report, you don't necessarily need to continue to fill out that same enabling competency in your future reports. However, if you have another experience, like let's say in 12 months you had a great example for communication, and now it's month 28 and you're, you know, I don't know, doing a great presentation to a group of stakeholders, and it's an even better example for communication, you might still want to document that enabling competency. So again, as a reviewer, when I'm looking at your experience as the total package ready to go to completion, ready to become a member, that will just be like the icing on the cake to say, yes, look at the student, look how great they've progressed through their career and how professional they are. So no, it's not required, especially if you don't have other examples. But if you have other great examples, by all means, continue to document them. It's great for you. It's great for your discussions with your mentor, and it's great for me as a reviewer to solidify my recommendation to put you forward to completion.
Mm-hmm. So I think those were the primary things. I think if we just leave you with anything, it's, you know, the practical experience reporting, it is progressive. And at the end of the day, your technical skills and your technical competency requirements, that core, that breadth, that's very important to meeting those requirements and becoming a member. But, you know, how you develop your soft skills and how you progress in those proficiencies across your duration are equally as important.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, to make sure that you're thinking along the wavelength of I'm developing, you know, my soft skills and my technical skills as I go.